So one of my biggest pet peeves is when someone calls a normal YouTube video a podcast when it's just a YouTube video shot in a podcast format. So this month I'm doing a whole series on podcasting and how it can benefit you and how to grow your podcast. And as an ex-podcaster who now uses YouTube primarily for my marketing, today I'm going to show you what's the difference between a traditional podcast and a YouTube podcast and what's the pros and cons of each. Okay, so first things first, what exactly is a podcast? So a podcast is basically just a digital audio file that you can download or listen to over the internet. That's simple. But we have to remember that podcasts started out like completely as like an audio medium. So you used to be able to listen to it on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, and it was just audio, no video. But when Spotify came out with video podcasts, and then also with platforms like YouTube, many podcasters, they now have the opportunity to use video as well in their podcasting. So I often get, asked the question, what's the difference between a YouTube video and a podcast? And the difference is podcasts, they were mainly audio at one point. And also podcasts have RSS feeds, which I'm going to talk about in a second, that actually distributes the podcast to multiple different platforms. Okay, so what is an RSS feed? A podcast RSS feed basically automatically updates the information relating to your podcast, without you having to do anything. So let's say you put your podcast on your podcast distribution platform, which I can share a few in a minute. You put it on one platform and it gets sent to all the other platforms without you having to do anything. So you put it on there and then it sends it to Spotify, it sends it to iHeartRadio, it sends it to Amazon Music, it sends it to Apple. So you put it on one place and it gets sent to all the other places. And basically your RSS feeds does this for you all at once. And then also on top of that, you also own your RSS feed. So let's say that you didn't want to use that platform anymore to host your podcast. You could then switch and take your RSS feed with you to the different platform. And also keep this in mind, because I am a YouTube strategist, that only select podcast platforms will actually let you upload to your YouTube channel as a podcast. Not all. So some popular distribution channels include like Blueberries, Buzzsprout, Anchor, or podcasts for, or was it Podcasters for Spotify, or Spotify for Podcasters, whatever it's called, that's not on here, but that's also a popular one. Castos, Podient, Simplecast, these are just like a few different places that you can host your podcast, right? And so you put your podcast on this one distribution channel and then it goes to all the other places. So it goes to Apple Music, it goes to Amazon Music, it goes to iHeartRadio, it goes to all these other different places once you set it up and you claim those platforms. Now on the topic of YouTube podcasts, right? So to be considered a podcast on YouTube, you have to upload it as a podcast and not as a normal YouTube video. And this is oftentimes what I see people sort of get wrong about, like, technically the way that they're naming their content. So you have to upload it to the podcast playlist. So if you have and this is just an example that I created, but if you upload it to the playlist, it has to have podcast next to it. And then also it will show up in the podcast section of your sort of channel content. And you can find this sort of in your YouTube analytics area. So if your YouTube podcast does not follow any of the criteria I just mentioned, including having an RSS feed, being uploaded to a podcast distribution channel that's not YouTube, and uploaded to the podcast section on YouTube, then technically you don't have a podcast. You have a YouTube video that's just filmed in a podcast format. So let's say you have a microphone and you're just speaking like a podcast. That's the podcast format, not really an actual podcast. And if you only upload your video podcast to YouTube, it's technically considered a YouTube podcast and not a traditional podcast because it does not have an RSS feed. Another thing about YouTube podcasts is they typically show up in the YouTube podcast section on YouTube. So if you go on the side handle bar over here, it usually says podcast, and then it will show up in the podcast section on YouTube. And it can also show up on your homepage as well, but this is just one specific place that YouTube podcasts specifically show up on YouTube. Okay, so what is the pros and cons of a traditional podcast versus a YouTube podcast? So this was actually my old podcast, and I uploaded it, the traditional way, and this is my YouTube. I currently do not have a YouTube podcast, but I just wanted to show the channel as an example. So with the traditional RSS feed podcast, some of the pros is it uses an RSS feed to distribute to your episodes to the other podcast directories like Apple, Spotify. This says Google Podcasts, but Google Podcasts is no longer a thing. It's actually just YouTube Podcast now. Another thing is it's audio first format. So, for the people who don't necessarily like to be on video, you don't have to be on video with podcasts. You can just literally shoot the audio of it. And then another pro is that people can consume their podcasts on the go. So whether it's on their phone or their desktop or whatever the case may be, they don't have to watch a video with that podcast. It's just strictly audio in most cases. Some of the cons of having a traditional podcast is that podcast directories, they don't have like strong search algorithms, and they don't have strong discoverability options through their algorithms. And this is one of the reasons why I switched from having like a traditional podcast to having a YouTube channel, because it's really up to you to sort of like get the word out about your podcast, to promote it and share it. And when I had my podcast, I did around 24 episodes, but I'm literally just now starting to see the podcast sort of like grow on its own organically. And I had that podcast like I think a year ago, so it's gonna take a while for it to sort of like show up in search organically if you go about it that way. And then another thing is, though video podcasts are becoming more common, not all podcast platforms support video yet. So Spotify, they're like one of the main ones that support video. YouTube also, of course, supports it, and it may be maybe like one or two others. The next thing is, like I was saying, podcasts rely on word of mouth, social media promotion, and sort of like existing audience engagement. So as on YouTube, you can put a YouTube video up, and YouTube basically promotes the video on its own, and technically you don't have to do anything after that. But no, with podcasts, you're actually going to have an audience, promote it to them, share it on social media to get the word out about it. And then another thing is, not all podcast platforms have like comment sections or likes or real-time interactions like YouTube. And then another con is if your content benefits from visuals like tutorials, reactions, and presentations, an audio-only format, since not all platforms have video, it may not be the best choice for you. So now we are on to YouTube podcasts. What are the pros and cons of using a YouTube podcast? So one of the pros, of course, is the massive discoverability with search, recommendations, the homepage. Like if you put your podcast on YouTube, then it's going to get pushed out to people, and you will get in front of new audiences if you do it the right way. Which I have a video coming out next week that explains sort of like how you're going to sort of like get the word about your podcast. But another thing is it has more engagement features. So of course you can see like people actually commenting on your podcast videos, and people actually liking or disliking it, sharing it. You can see all of that through like the analytics. Another pro is that YouTube SEO helps your podcast rank in more search results like Google and Bing and Yahoo and even YouTube. So that brings in like more traffic. So again, it's better at promoting your podcast. And then there's like even additional monetization opportunities that you'll have for the podcast. So like ad revenue, the YouTube Partner Program. You could do super chats, memberships on your YouTube channel, which you can't necessarily do on sort of like the other podcast platforms. You can do the normal ways to monetize, like services and, brand partnerships and stuff like that. But YouTube brings in probably like an additional 5 different types of monetization opportunities that you can use. And then another pro is the repurposing potential. And I also have another video coming out about this later down the line this month, but the repurposing potential with YouTube podcasts is infinite. There's infinite ways that you can repurpose a YouTube podcast, and there's infinite ways that you can promote a traditional podcast as well. But if it's video, there's even more ways that you can repurpose it, Okay, now we're on to the cons of it. Some of the cons is, one, video production effort. So, you're going to want to invest into some sort of like camera, and make sure you have a nice camera. And it doesn't have to be like a physical like DSLR camera, but you're going to have a webcam that looks, somewhat presentable, because you are now on YouTube. So that's like kind of like one more thing that you have to worry about. So I see a lot of podcasts, like remote podcast shooting, and they just use like their laptop webcams or something like that. So it doesn't have to be like 4K, like super professional, but it does have to be, presentable. Another one is platform dependency. So on YouTube podcasts, your content is at the mercy of YouTube rules and policies and, the potential demonetization risk. So if you talk about something that's maybe a little bit more riskier, then it's like, you might not be able to get those additional revenue streams that YouTube has to offer, because they can take your channel down at any time, they can demonetize you, they can do whatever they want with your podcast. Another con with YouTube is it's not ideal for audio only listeners because it is video. So it's like, I know for me as a person who, I have like a few different podcasts that I listen to like weekly, and I like to like listen to them like going on a walk, or I'll listen to them like while doing something else. And personally for me, I find YouTube to be very distracting while I'm doing other things. But with a podcast, it's just like, it's like kind of listening to your friend talk in the background. For situations like that, it's not really ideal because, and I think if you get a certain YouTube if you get a certain YouTube feature, then you're able to turn off your phone. But if you have like the normal YouTube app, you can't just turn off your phone and put it in your pocket, because the video is just going to stop. You're not going to hear anything. So that's what I mean by it's not ideal for audio only listeners. And then, competition is a little higher. So with podcasts, they go on the podcast platform, they choose your podcast, and then, it's like a lot of loyalty there. YouTube is saturated with content, and if you've ever shopped on Etsy, it's kind of like that. Etsy is a platform for like people to put their digital products and physical products on there. But on the side and at the bottom of their products that you sell, there's like recommended products from other stores that's like selling the same thing as you. So that's kind of like how YouTube is. It's going to be showing people other pieces of content that's going to be related to what they want to watch to keep them on the platform longer. So, you have to really, make sure your podcast is worth listening to in that sense, and that they'll stay the whole way through if, they're really interested. And, it does require more branding techniques than just putting it on like in a traditional RSS feed. Like with a traditional RSS feed, you could just put your podcast cover up or art up with there and not have to worry about nothing else. But with YouTube, you gotta make sure your thumbnails are great. You gotta make sure your channel stands out. And I'm gonna talk about this again in another video because it's a different topic. But yeah, you just have to basically make sure you stand out a little bit more on YouTube. So, which one should you choose? If your goal is to reach more people, get clients, and grow your brand, then both are suitable. But if you want more discoverability, I recommend like YouTube podcasts specifically. Just because with YouTube, the algorithm promotes the video for you, or the podcast for you rather. However, if you do want to reach a more traditional sort of like podcast base, you should use the RSS feed. And, if I was starting my podcast over again, I would have honestly put my podcast on both. I would have put it on the traditional feed, and I would have also put it on YouTube as well. So then my podcast would have been discovered by more people. But then also, if they wanted to listen to it on the go, they had the option, and they would be able to sort of like switch over to like Spotify, or whatever their chosen platform for listening to podcast was. So yeah, thank you for watching. Comment below, are you thinking of starting a podcast? Was this helpful to you? Where are you going to host your podcast at? And also be on the lookout for the remaining of the series, where I show you how to promote your podcast, the podcast workflow, and also the best ways to actually put your podcast on YouTube.